Okay, so now we can move on to the next three attribute curves which deal with luma and saturation as opposed to hue. So we're going to take a look at what these curves do and why we might want to use them. So I've made a new node here just to help keep things clean, and as we said beforehand, the best way to handle your node tree is to kind of split your nodes up into goals. So I've got primary grade, basic, secondary, skin and background. In this one, I want to deal with problematic saturation. Okay, I'm going to deal with the kind of crazy out of control blue in the background here. So how are we going to do that? I'm going to go to the fourth icon along here, and that is the sunshine symbol and the raindrop, or the water droplet. And this is luma versus saturation. So I'm going to click the pop out just so you can see it. And let's just take a look at what we've got here. So I don't have the full spectrum of colours like I had before. On this one, I've just got black going through to white. And what this is showing us is we've got our dark values on the left and our bright values on the right. And we have the exact same histogram down here before. Now it's a different shape because it's charting a different value against frequency. This time it's brightness, not hue. So this is showing me I've got a lot of very, very black pixels here, some very dark ones, then kind of middle dark, kind of, you know, maybe about 30-odd% brightness here, and then the rest of the image is brighter, but it's not so concentrated. So we have quite a bright image with a lot of the dark values being quite kind of bunched together, and that's fairly typical, to be honest with you, with the way light falls and the way light behaves. So what can I do with this curve? Well, basically what this allows me to do is change the saturation of pixels based on how bright they are. And I'm just going to set up a little example, bear with me. So let's take a look at the saturation in my shadows. Now I've just made my shadows go green and they look weird and unnatural, but we're going to partially deal with this using the lum versus sat curve, because actually this one can be very useful and it's one I use a lot. One of the problems we have, and you'll see this later on with the HSL keyer when we cover it, is that our shadows contain pixels of almost every different color, but they look black because they have a very low saturation. And that can cause problems. They can pick up odd colors and behave in weird ways. Sometimes you get little like red or blue dusty noisy bits in the shadows. Sometimes you end up picking up shadows in a qualification that you don't want to pick up because of this and all of this kind of thing. So lum versus saturation is quite useful in cleaning our shadows out, and I do use it quite a lot. What I will do is I've already start with a point at the left and the right here. So I just need to add one more point. I will add a point somewhere around here. And I can drag my leftmost point up, and you can see up here those green shadows are getting brighter. In fact, they're getting so bright I can begin to make out detail that was lost before. Or I can drag it down. And what you can see is that that green quality is actually being pulled out, and the shadows are going kind of charcoaly and a bit more black and neutral. So I can use this tool to keep any odd color casts in my shadows under control. And this shape of curve that I'm drawing here, I do actually use this quite a lot. It's not normally this strong, but I do very often keep problematic shadows clean and neutral by doing this, and can help deal with odd little bits of color cast or things that might get introduced when I'm working with the log wheels. So now we can see before our shadows are kind of green and look weird, and now we've taken that color cast out. So that's one way to use this. It can be used to handle a color cast in the shadows. It's always better to use your shadow wheel and midtone wheel to do that and get them neutral that way. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes the problem in the shadows has arisen from another operation you've performed, and then we come back to this and we use the lum versus sat curve to fix that. So that's the main real use case I have for this tool, is to keep color casts in the shadows under control. The same can also be said, let's say we have some weird highlights. Maybe we shot with a color cast and our highlights do that weird fluorescent yellow thing when we try and make the image neutral. We can bring our highlights down as well, Now in this image that's not going to do anything because the highlights here are fine, but if you have like a weird blue or yellow in what should be white highlights, or like a practical light can sometimes do that, then this tool can help you keep those under control as well. Just like in the previous curves, a kind of smooth rolling curve is what you're looking for. You don't want a zigzag. And you do usually kind of overshoot to get the effect you want. You want a lot of roll off. So you do often feel like you're overshooting with your working range when you set these points down. And a curve that looks like this, I've used this a lot, this kind of double-ended curve for kind of funny highlights or funny shadows, or if something was shot with bad color balance or under weird artificial lighting, like in a club nightclub lighting. I do this quite a lot because there's all kinds of weird, wonderful colors going on there that don't play nice with camera sensors. So this is quite a good one for nightlife and that kind of footage. So this is essentially Lum versus Sat. I qualify based on luma, brightness, and then I change saturation, primarily used to keep your highlights and shadows in check. Whilst you can boost your midtones, there are far more precise ways of doing that, so I wouldn't recommend doing that with this curve. So now we'll take a look at the next one, and this is saturation versus saturation. Now that sounds really weird, but this curve is actually a real time saver. It can be very, very good. Let me just go back to the other curve and reset that. Saturation versus saturation. So if I go back to this previous node, and I will just, give me 1 second. I will saturate the daylights out of this blue. And then I will push global saturation up as well, just to make sure we really get the point. So obviously this is a terrible image and it doesn't look good. We're not going to deliver something that looks like this. It is just for demonstration purposes. But let's go back to Sat versus Sat so we can have a look at what we're dealing with here. Now again, that's the 2 raindrops. Give us saturation versus saturation. So Sat versus Sat qualifies based on saturation and then lets us change saturation. And you're going to hear the phrase saturation so much that it's going to lose all meaning and just become a kind of mouth noise by the end of this lesson. But what this essentially means is we can take pixels which are very saturated and bring them down. And this is probably the key use case for this tool that I've found, is if something has gone crazy, if a particular material known for kind of misbehaving in front of the camera, say artificial fabrics, brightly coloured plastics, anything coloured with light shining through it, so stained glass, translucent plastics, even ears, earlobes, and the webbing between fingers held up to the sun can go kind of bright red or pink, then the Sat versus Sat curve can actually be very useful in bringing those things back under control. So let's just give an example of the saturation versus saturation. Obviously the blue has gone bananas here. Anyway, this blue has gone bananas here. So I want to make a curve which brings down the right hand side, and you can see on the vector scope that I'm bringing all the most saturated crazy bits back down under control. And if I drag it right down, you can see there it's having the impact on those colors. Skin tones can be quite bright and saturated. They're generally not the strongest colors in the image, despite being the most important. And so this curve can do quite a lot whilst sparing our skin tones, as we can see here. You know, if I'm working on like the right-hand side of this graph, I'm not doing a lot that's visible to these skin tones. And the skin tone colors which are being hit, you can see on the vector scope, are maybe the hoodie, the pink in the rose, the yellow in the center of the rose or the flower back here, this pink paint in the right-hand side. So we can actually be quite sensitive to our skin tones whilst using this curve. And I just want to bring this down until that blue is sensible again. And that has the benefit of also bringing down other problematic colours that might be running amok as well. And this kind of shape when dealing with the Sat v Sat curve is very common. What you will notice is if I just make a kind of curve like this, we get this flat reading on the vector scope, and what that means is that where we should have a natural roll-off and variation in saturation, everything's becoming flattened. And when things get flattened like this, we lose contrast, we lose visible detail. So we want to avoid truncated and flattened signals like this. And that's why very often we make a curve this shape. And I appreciate it's hard to see white on white, but that's just the way that Resolve has made the UI here. That's very often why we make this shape on the curve here. So this is a fairly standard, bring the crazy colors back under control. This isn't a standard practice thing. This is something you elect to do situationally based on the colors you're dealing with. And children's toys, football shirts and sports uniforms, traffic cones, plastic cups and beakers, like just anything made of coloured plastic might need attention from this tool or from a HSL keyer later on. And it's generally what it's used for, is bringing those few outliers down. There's generally not a lot of need to bring the least saturated pixels up because of the issues with shadows containing all kinds of different colours that I've mentioned before. You end up getting shadows that have weird green, red and blue dots dancing around in them if you do this kind of operation on this curve. So don't bother doing that unless you really need to for some reason to mix your footage stylized. So that's essentially it for sat vsat. When we get to middling saturation values, unless you want to give like a uniform boost and not upset things too much, what we can do is make a curve that looks more like this. And this can give a boost to our kind of low middling colours, but it's not going to make anything saturated go crazy. That's quite a common one as well. But outside of these, there's not a lot of use case for this tool. It's fairly specific. So we've had a look at Luma versus sat and sat versus sat. Now we're going to look at the final curve, which is saturation versus Luma. And this one exists just because this is a combination of those variables, which is possible. I don't typically have a use case for this tool, just like with hue versus Luma. I suspect it was designed and created because the others were, and you just had to switch the logic around a bit to do it, maybe. I don't know. I imagine software design is much more complicated than that. But because we had Luma versus sat, we've also got sat versus Luma. Now, Luma versus sat qualifies based on Luma and changes the saturation of pixels based on how bright they are. Saturation versus Luma is the opposite. It qualifies based on saturation, and then it changes brightness based on how saturated those pixels are. I can use this tool to say, look, I want all of my least saturated pixels to get much brighter. And if I bring the left-hand side up, it's going to bring my highlights up and also my shadows, because my highlights and my shadows are typically the least saturated colours in the image. I don't know why you would do this. It's just like the hue versus Luma. It introduces all kinds of noise. Well, it exacerbates noise and introduces all kinds of visible artifacting. I've never once used this curve in a grade that I delivered. I used to try and experiment with it a lot, thinking it's here, it must have a use, but I honestly don't see it. So I almost never use this curve, and I've never once made a point of using it in a project that I've delivered professionally. It just doesn't have a place in my toolbox, to be honest with you. So that's it with these curves. They're a bit more niche and a bit more situational. Luma versus saturation and sat versus sat can be very useful for highly specific problems, but you wouldn't necessarily use them in every single shot. It's just as and when you need to. Again, sat versus Luma, Lord only knows. So go ahead and play around with your footage a little bit more. Just get a feel for these tools. I really would recommend getting a feel for Lum vsat and sat vsat, because there's going to be a shot you hit in your own projects where you think, this is a highly specific problem. That one thing is going crazy, or my shadows, I just can't stop my shadows from going blue here. I can't get the wheels to do that for me. And then these curves they're gonna save you then. So make sure that you put some practice time in with these, and then click on through to the next lecture